And apparently we are live.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Intelligent Disclosure. I'm the disclosure part, and I think you're the intelligent part. That's what I think we're going to be doing. Welcome. Thanks for joining us in our humble little home in Rochester, New York. We're happy to be here with you. And I'll be talking in very shortly about enormous UFOs, the long history of objects that aren't just like ordinary size of an aircraft. Let me move this up a little bit, but in fact, gargantuan size, or at least the size of a football field and beyond. And the implications of that are really quite interesting, and we're going to get right into that. But I think we want to do a couple of catch-up things first.
Yeah, let's just talk about what's been going on. Last time we were talking about Alien Con. We just got back from that.
We did do that whole thing, and I'm over at the members side. Right, if you go to Richard L. Members, I've been doing a lot of discussion just recently on abduction phenomenon, and particularly I've been really focusing on the work of Dr. David Jacobs.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'll have a couple of live streams in the near future. I think we're going to talk about that.
I think that'd be great.
Particularly his book, Walking Among Us, that is the culmination, really, of his life's work. And we've been diving into that in a lot of detail over at Richard L. Members. What else have we been?
I was just going to say, I think that'd be a really important thing to talk about. He's come up with a theory that is really floating around out there. So I think I look forward to that. I hope.
Yeah.
I think a lot of other people would too.
I think so, for sure.
As far as what else has been going on, we have a newsletter. If you've already signed up and you haven't seen it, check your inbox. That went out late last night. If you would like to check out the newsletter, that is available on richarddolanmembers.com. You can sign up. There's a gray box. You can sign up in there.
You want to tell them about the store?
Yes.
We have a store.
We have a store.
Who knew?
We did not expect to have a store, but we thought we'd try it out. And
here's the thing. People want to buy stuff. Like sometimes people want to buy stuff.
Right. And often things that we do are inspired by what you're telling us. So some of the cool things people say, some of the great comments people write, the things in chat inspire us and give us these ideas. So thank you to everyone. And so we have our first design.
You're talking about
the store in the Richard Dolan store.
You're talking about the image, the truth image.
Yes.
Yeah, this is we have it here, but I almost don't want to show it because it's kind of crazy. So everyone remembers the Obama hope. Some people loved Obama, some people hated Obama, but look, the guy had a pretty cool poster, you got to admit. The kind of graphic, white, red, black, red, white, and blue thing, and it said hope. I'm not into hope. Anyone who knows me, that's not my thing, but I am into truth. And so we have a truth poster, and you can go to the Richard Dolan store. You can take a look at that. We also have T-shirts. Of course, if you have a store, you have to have T-shirts. And I think we're going to be moving into some other things probably like Kirby-style vacuum cleaners, I'm assuming, household appliances, dishwashers, and the like. So keep in mind, we'll look into that.
Anyway,
moving right along. We'll have other things there. No idea what.
But, that is one thing I think we all think of you. Truth is what you stand for. And so that's why it's truth. So
there's really nothing else. I mean, I'd like to have, these wonderful fantasy beliefs in utopia, and I've never been able to go there. Mm-hmm. So the only solace I have, honestly, is in finding out what is true. That's it. Nothing else. If I can find out what's true, I figure I'm more than halfway there.
All right.
Towards satisfaction in whatever it is. Got to find out what's true.
Shall we? Shall we move right along here? This is a fun topic.
Oh yeah, no, I'm interested in this one. I've been really diving into, getting into some very, very unusual dramatic UFO accounts. Like last week, I talked about dramatic aerial encounters, incredible encounters in the air. And this is in that theme, except it's not simply dramatic encounters in the air. It's sightings of things that are so large, they shouldn't exist, but they appear to exist.
I think this is super fascinating. These multi-light unidentified flying objects. And then the other thing that really captures me is sightings that last 20 minutes or longer. You know, when people, like the Hudson Valley sightings that we dove into at one point, people standing at the side of the road, tons of people.
Right.
That's another thing that's super fascinating. And
a few that I'm going to describe tonight are fairly long-lasting sightings, and others are kind of normal duration. So,
before we get started, are we allowed to say anything about what we saw last night?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, we were given a screen, a limited view screener for the new Bob Lazar movie, that's created by Jeremy Corbell, who's an outstanding filmmaker in our opinion. And we were able to see that, and I guess we can just give a quick assessment that it was very well done. Very well done. I think we'll come back and talk about this one too. But anyone interested in the Bob Lazar story, which is anyone interested in UFOs, in my opinion, I think we'll find this of great value.
I think it's going to be a great contribution to the UFO community and a helpful bridge for skeptics. And for
totally
all of
agree.
us to be able to communicate with people who are skeptics.
Totally agree. Yeah, we actually did a half-hour private breakdown of it last night after we saw it, which we recorded. We haven't even uploaded that to our site. So, but anyway, it's definitely interesting, well done. I think a fair treatment of a very complex, fascinating part of our history. George Knapp figures very heavily into it as well. If you know the story, no surprise. And a lot of other people that, really, really good to see in that. So
right. So you can look forward to an interview with Jeremy.
Oh, yes. I'm going to be talking with Jeremy Corbell about this in the next few days, and we'll have it uploaded.
And hopefully we can get George Knapp too. That would be
absolutely want to get George Knapp to do an interview. I think we can.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to let you get going.
You're going to go over there?
I am.
All right. Everyone's going to be missing you. I've already noticed a couple of borderline pervy comments.
I can't read them
without my glasses not really, but getting close there. I, for one, am very glad that you've got your.
I'm glad I can't read
those. It's just as well. So, so here we are. I want to talk about very large UFOs, and I want to knock this light down a little bit. This is going to be killing me here. And also, I'm of the opinion that the light is sometimes a little too intense. This is my opinion.
Oh yeah, we can turn it down.
All right, there we go. So again, I want to just say welcome to everyone who's here. I want to talk about very large, let's say enormous at times UFOs. And these things have been reported. UFOs have been reported in all sizes, obviously, from the size of a basketball or even a baseball. There have been reports of objects that small with incredible maneuverability going all the way back through the 20th century. To then the seemingly typical size, you often hear of something like 30 feet in diameter, say about 10 meters in diameter. That's the size of an ordinary front lawn in a suburban or an urban neighborhood, for example. And then you get the large ones. So there are objects that are described as 100 feet in diameter. Now, at that point, 100 feet in diameter, you're getting fairly large. And just as a point of reference, so if you think of a large passenger liner like a Boeing 747 or an Airbus 400, those types of airliners that are designed to go intercontinental, those are very large. They'll have a length of, say, 220, 250 feet, something like that. So not quite the length of an American football field, but very long. And the wingspans are just nearly as wide as the fuselage is long. So those are very large objects. But if you want to get a sense of the scale here, what we're talking about. So the interior, I looked this up in preparation for this. The interior of one of these large intercontinental airliners is roughly about 30,000 cubic feet. So we're talking the fuselage. I'm not talking about the wings. But the fuselage is very large, where all the people are within. It's about 30,000 cubic feet or so. But then consider something that's 100 feet wide by just say 15 feet tall. Not an unusual dimension, what we've heard. If you think of the volume of that, all right, it's that those are over 100,000 cubic feet, about 115,000 cubic feet. So that's 3 times or more, 3.5 times the interior volume of a Boeing 747. And that's just a disk with an object with a diameter of 100 feet, and that's 15 feet high. Now that's large, but consider that UFOs have been reported to be much larger than this. Not unusually, you'll hear phrases like football field, being used to describe the size of these things. As I said a moment ago, an American football field is 100 yards long or 300 feet long. So take something that's got a diameter of 200 feet. Now that's very large indeed. And again, nearly the length of a Boeing 747, but of course much larger because it's a disk. And so if you take an object that's got a diameter of 200 feet and give it a height of, let's say, 25 feet, because it's a bit larger and it would probably be of a thickness of that amount. Now we're talking about a volume of close to 1 million cubic feet, about 785 cubic feet, my estimate, or 25 times the volume of the fuselage of a 747. And now you take something that's 300 feet in diameter, so football field size. It's not only longer than any commercial airliner, but the volume difference is off the charts. We're talking about 1.7 million cubic feet if you give it the height of about 25 feet, and if it's about 300 feet in diameter, nearly 2 million cubic feet. That's about 55 or more times larger than the interior of a Boeing 747 intercontinental jet airliner. So, and with these types of sizes, we're just getting started. There are UFOs that have been reported even significantly larger than that. So with that in mind, I just want to go through a little bit of the history of some of these interesting sightings of these enormous and at times gargantuan UFOs that have been reported, in my view, under very reliable conditions. And I'm going to talk about these now, starting with one from 1949 at White Sands, New Mexico. This is actually April 29th, 1949. White Sands is a very important testing range for rockets and experimental aerial objects, very much under the control of the United States military and scientific community. So back in the late 40s, we've got a number of cases. This, in fact, the one I'm about to refer to was reported in True magazine, a very major mainstream magazine back in that time, in its March 1950 issue. So on April 29th, 1949, at White Sands, you have a bunch of scientists, and they see what they describe as a huge elliptical object. This is one of the cases I'm going to describe that doesn't have an estimated diameter, but everyone watching this apparently was very impressed by the size of this thing. They did have precision instruments with them to track the speed of this object. And it was going at a very, very high altitude, many, many miles above the Earth. But they had instruments like theodolites and other types of telescopic instruments that were able to measure the speed of this, which they calculated at 5 miles per second, or that is 18,000 miles per hour. They said this was not a natural satellite of any sort at all. There were also several smaller disk type objects that were watched from a number of observation posts at White Sands Proving Ground, circling around at incredible speeds. In fact, the two of the disks that were associated with this enormous object were seen pacing a high altitude Army rocket that had just been launched. The objects then sped up and swiftly outclimbed the rocket. So again, I don't have the size of this object, but it was described as huge and moving at extremely rapid speed, very high up, by military scientists who were testing rockets at White Sands Proving Ground. Here's another one, an early one that doesn't have a size, but I wanted to include this because it just impressed the witnesses so much. This was from March of 1950, March 8th. And what's interesting about it is that it was over Dayton, Ohio, which is the headquarters of the United States Air Force, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It was considered one of the best UFO sightings of the year. Donald Keyhoe and Edward Ruppelt, two significant writers of the 50s, wrote about this. Ruppelt was very impressed by it, and he just said this was right over the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. You had initially this was seen by a commercial airliner, and then you have several F-51 fighter pilots getting radar and visuals of what is an enormous, huge UFO, huge and metallic UFO. They all seem to agree on this. It was hidden in a cloud formation, but they had a radar tracking and a visual of it. And the Air Force just said, nope, it was the planet Venus. And oh yeah, the radar sightings, that was simply a misidentification due to ice-filled clouds. That's fine, except everyone in the radar room and the eyewitnesses themselves vehemently disagreed with this. And they, in fact, told Ruppelt that the craft was huge and metallic. And another one of without a diameter, but I'm going to come to those. This is from 1952. And again, I like these cases because they're military ones. They seem to have very good witnesses involved. This one was from near Hamilton Air Force Base in California. This is an Air Force intelligence report, and it involved two silvery discs that were described as huge that were circling the base. This one also had visuals and radar. You have F-86 fighter jets dispatched to investigate this. When they did so, 6 more discs appeared, and they took up a diamond formation and just swiftly accelerated out of sight. So there were 8 of these discs altogether. One of the witnesses was an off-duty pilot, and he watched this with his neighbor for about 15 minutes. So it was a very long sighting. Watched the maneuvers, watched them break off into a trailing type of formation. And in fact, one of them dove, and as it dove, the size seemed to almost become enlarged even more. It was almost like an optical illusion. But this was a very, very interesting case indeed. So here's another one from 1952, and this one had kind of a political repercussion, at least within the military. So this came through retired Marine Corps Major Donald Keyhoe, who again was really the most significant UFO researcher of the 50s and I think well into the 1960s. Keyhoe was a clearinghouse for these cases. He had a lot of connections within the US military, Navy and Marines particularly, but also Air Force and the Army as well. So he learns about this one. This is a Gulf of Mexico sighting in December 6, 1952. During the training flight of a B-29 air bomber craft. This included radar and visual reports with very accurate details, it seems to me. So here's the thing. It involved a B-29 is in a training flight and a near collision with a UFO. They're flying at, I think, 18,000 feet. The estimated speed of this object was not less than 5,000 miles per hour. Now, there's no meteor that goes that slowly, but this thing, there's no aircraft that could even approach that speed at all. Before this object went off the radar scopes, they said it was tracked at 9,000 miles per hour, and it was huge. But actually, what was even more large was the mothership that it seemed to connect with. And I don't know the size of that, but it was described in Keyhoe's information as a mothership. The thing about this that I thought was very interesting is a young Edward Ruppelt, who was in the Air Force for Project Bluebug at the time, reported this to the higher ups in the military. And they were like, where did this come from? And he's like, this was actually leaked to Donald Keyhoe. And a high-level general just says, how the hell did Keyhoe get those reports? And this was the key report that triggered the Air Force making sure that Donald Keyhoe did not get any more of these leaked reports coming from within the military. So very, very interesting. But what's interesting is that Keyhoe continued to get a lot of these. This is one an undated one from 1953. And it came to him through a Navy Admiral Delmer Farney, who I believe within the Navy was known as the father of the guided missile, at least the Navy's version of it. He was a very important admiral, a very good friend of Kehoe, deeply interested in UFOs himself, knew that they were real. And so Farney gets this report and sends it off to Kehoe. And in fact, there's another version of this report that also ended up to Kehoe. So we've got two different sources of it. So basically, you have on one day in 1953, you have a squadron of Navy aircraft. They're known as AD-3s. I had to look this up. And they were known as a Hefty Betty. That was the nickname of these aircraft. Anyway, there's a squadron of them off of a carrier. They're practicing offshore combat maneuvers. So as they're reforming into their formation, they see an enormous, kind of like cigar-shaped object. They described it as enormous, swooping down over them. It swiftly decelerated to their speed. It leveled off about 1,000 feet above them, above the squadron. The pilots decided they were going to spread out, and they climbed at full throttle toward this aircraft. It was described as a giant craft. And as they're climbing up to get it, it makes a sharp turn, and then with a tremendous burst of energy or power, it just shoots away into the sky. It vanishes in seconds. An interesting aftermath of this case, according to what Kehoe learned, you have 3 Air Force intelligence officers are flown in to this carrier. And I don't know what the aircraft carrier was, but an Air Force colonel takes charge, and he's grilling the Navy men. He's not consulting the captain of the ship, which really annoys the Navy men. Look, you can't just have an Air Force guy come in and start pushing Navy guys around on an aircraft carrier. That's a big no-no. And they've got a lot of pride. They don't want Air Force guys bossing them around. Anyway, the Air Force colonel tells these Navy guys to say, you are not to discuss this with anyone, not even among yourselves. The thing, though, is that there was no Navy order telling them to do this that backed up the Air Force colonel. And this is why almost certainly the report leaked to Navy Admiral Delmer Farney. The Navy guys are like, the hell with this. We're going to talk about this all we want. And it, from Farney, ended up to Kehoe. Fascinating. So in other words, you've got this large, enormous cigar-shaped object swooping down over Navy squadron doing maneuvers, and then zooming away when they go after it at some point in 1953. That's just amazing. There's another one that came to Kehoe. Kehoe is just an amazing source of these, and I'm really happy to be going through these. We don't have a date on this one. This one came to Kehoe sometime in the early 1960s, and by the time he got to it, it was just said to have occurred sometime back, I'm going to guess sometime in the mid-1950s, but we really have no idea. But I want to describe this one. This one also came through Farney, Admiral Delmer Farney, and it concerned a Navy pilot. This pilot's name was George Brent. So Brent was flying a Navy transport plane near Newfoundland, Canada. So as they're flying this aircraft, he and his crew get a close-up view of what they describe as a huge flying disc with a glow around the rim. Now, this has a size estimate, and he said this was well over 300 feet in diameter and at least 30 feet thick at the center. So well more than the length of a football field. And, decent size in its height at the center. They were able to get more detail of this object. So they saw a reflecting type of a surface. It was apparently some kind of smooth, metallic-looking surface. And this thing, if you remember my live stream from a week ago, I talked about some of these immense, incredible aviation encounters where objects would approach very rapidly, scare the hell out of the pilots, and then veer off. It happened here. So this object, this huge object, much, much larger than their aircraft, approaches very rapidly, nearly collides with them. The crew said that they got a 10-second view of this before the object just zoomed away at a speed that they estimated at being about 2,000 knots. That's about 2,300 miles per hour. And I just want to give some perspective here. Back in the mid-1950s, the world speed record, world aviation speed records were just breaking like 1,000 miles per hour. So around 1955 to 1956, I think they surpassed 1,000 miles per hour. So that's pretty fast. This thing was estimated at double or more than double the top speed of the top performing aircrafts in the world at that time. All right. With the difference that this thing was enormous. I mean, enormous. So anyway, the story is not over. So this pilot, Brent, and his entire crew, when they land, are interrogated by Air Force intelligence officers. No surprise there. He's later shown classified photos, one of which portrays a disc similar to what he saw. And he was also later interviewed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, according to what he said to his Navy people. But no one at Wright-Patterson was willing to answer any of his questions about the UFO. They're asking him, he's asking them questions back. They're not giving him a thing here. And it's very interesting. When Kehoe got this report in 1962, he was in the middle of trying to promote, again, congressional investigations or hearings on UFOs. This is a periodic effort that he was doing throughout his time in the 1950s and 60s. So he was trying to get more detail on this case to use it for a congressional investigation. And he had contacts with one particular Navy person. He never gave this guy's name up, but he gave him a pseudonym in one of his books. Anyway, he asked this Navy guy, he says, look, more information on this particular case. And the guy says, I'll try. I think that I might be able to. And this guy got into significant trouble, apparently, for trying to look into it. He got back to Kehoe and he says, that Navy call raised hell. Less than an hour after he made an inquiry into the case, he said there were 2 CIA agents at his door who said really gave him the 3rd degree. They made him tell who wanted the report, and he ended up telling the CIA agents pretty much everything they wanted, and told them about this congressional plan that Kehoe had to come out and investigate UFOs in conjunction with former CIA Director Roscoe Hillenkoetter of the Navy. Hillenkoetter was a Navy admiral who was CIA director and was a friend of Kehoe's, and they were working on this together. So this guy spills the beans on all of that, including Hillenkoetter's participation. And immediately after this, Hillenkoetter resigned from NICAP. That was the organization that he and Kehoe were in to investigate UFOs, and basically left the UFO field altogether forever and ever. And that was the end of Roscoe Hillenkoetter. So this particular undated case from the mid-1950s actually helped to derail what might have been a genuine congressional investigation into UFOs that involved a former director of the CIA, Roscoe Hillenkoetter. Just fascinating little bits of history, but it involved an enormous UFO, a huge UFO that engaged the United States Navy. So, and it just goes on and on. There's one case that I stumbled across in researching this from the mid-1960s, actually February 11, 1965, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean between Alaska and Japan. And I'm mentioning this because, Alaska is the scene of another fascinating event that took place in the 80s. I'll get to that in a minute. But this one in 1965 was an aerial encounter. It was a radar visual sighting by an Air Force officer and a flight crew of 3 huge UFOs that paced this aircraft and engaged in a very rapid upward acceleration as this aircraft was en route from Anchorage to Japan. Involved glowing red objects, pacing them for about 30 minutes. So it was a very long, and it just departed at well over like 1,500 miles per hour. And this pilot, this is the thing that really got my attention, later remarked, this is in the 60s, he said he often would see UFOs on the Alaskan run. So there you go. And it just reminds me, and a lot of people who are familiar with the UFO, the history of these encounters, are familiar with the Jaeil Japan Airliner sighting from November of 1986, November 18th. And just very quickly, because it's been discussed a lot, but it involved a commercial flight of transporting expensive French wine from Japan to the U.S. and had flown over the Arctic. And as it's over Alaska for about a half an hour, the crew of that aircraft tracked on radar and saw visually an enormous, I mean, actually gargantuan sized object. At one point, that object detached two smaller objects that remained directly in front of the airplane's cockpit. And it bathed them in this, I think, greenish light for quite some time. These objects were maneuvering. They were dancing around in front of the airliner. I mean, the airliner is moving along at, 400 or 500 miles per hour. These things are pacing it and maneuvering in front of it. Just astonishing. Meanwhile, this huge object, I mean, multiple times, many multiple times larger than the aircraft itself, was pacing it, which was also tracked on multiple ground-based radars. Just an amazing sight. We also have the statement, by the way, from the Federal Aviation Administration official, John Callahan, who years later described how the CIA and other intelligence groups tried to confiscate all the information pertaining to that case and to silence all of the people involved. Callahan, of course, was a witness for the Disclosure Project many years ago and talked about this. Just fascinating stuff. So again, another enormous UFO. There's only a couple more I want to get into here. I'm going to take it through some of the 20th century, and then I want to do a little bit of wrap up. This is a Chinese case from the late 70s, 1978. And like a lot of Chinese cases, particularly of that time period, we have some information and we lack a lot of other information. But this one appeared in a CIA file, and it involved a lot of ground witnesses who were Chinese fighter pilots. So it took place in October of 1978 in a northwestern Chinese province of Gansu. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but you had several hundred military personnel, and they're watching an outdoor movie. And, just kind of downtime, right? And they see this enormous object pass over their heads, very low, very close to the ground. This thing had two searchlights, and it had a glowing rear, and they watching it for up to 3 minutes, as far as we can see. And as I said, a lot of these witnesses were fighter pilots, and no one had the slightest idea of what this object could be. The CIA report that we have, and you can find this on the web now, it was obtained through FOIA years ago, said that witnesses, at least some witnesses, said the object covered half the sky. Now, if it's going to cover half the sky, presumably it's low, but my God, that's a really large object. And that's performing in this manner. Like, what is this? This is in the western part of China. Your guess is as good as mine. In 1978, what could that be? There's even a more dramatic case, and this is one of my favorite ones to talk about. And I've mentioned it many times. I'll just mention it briefly here, but it's also from 1978 in December of that year, December 16th. And this was from the Air Force of the nation of Chile in South America. And this was an utterly gargantuan sized UFO. So you've got in the afternoon, this is a daylight sighting. You've got two pilots on a standard training mission. They're flying, and each is flying an F-5 fighter plane, and they each track on their airborne radar an object that gives a radar return that is equal to 10 aircraft carriers. All right. So their initial thought, as you might think, is, oh, well, our instrumentation's really screwy, but they're each getting it. So that's odd on two separate aircraft. And then ground-based radar is also getting an enormous object, and confirmed that whatever this thing is, it's gargantuan in size. So you got three radars, and then you've got the pilots seeing it with their own eyes. And what they're seeing totally confirms the radar estimate of the size. One of the pilots later said he saw this at a distance of about 20 miles. He said it looked like it was a very elongated object within a kind of smoke or cloudy atmosphere. Now, these guys are on a training mission, so they didn't have any weapons. They had no missiles, nothing like that. And they were not afraid. They were not ashamed to say that they were frightened by the object. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, because as the pilots are approaching this object, this thing, whatever it was, that had been motionless all the time, takes off at an unimaginable speed. All at once, it vanishes visually, and it vanishes from all three radar screens, the two airborne and the one ground-based radar that was tracking it, and it goes over the Pacific Ocean, and it's just gone. So, what could that be? By the way, that Chilean base, several hours later in the evening, 3 more Chilean F-5s were sent to intercept another very large UFO. And whether it was the same object or not, we have no idea. I don't think anyone really knows. But 2 of those pilots saw it visually, and they described it simply as very large and very bright. And what's interesting, by the way, the last thing I'll say about this is that several months later, the Chilean Air Force actually acknowledged these events, and they said, yes, this happened. And maybe not so surprisingly, didn't try to explain what had happened. I mean, what could they possibly say about it? Really nothing. So, if this object was as large as 10 aircraft carriers, I mean, one aircraft carrier is as long as roughly 3 football fields. That's one aircraft carrier as long as 3 football fields, so about roughly 1,000 feet. This thing was described as having the return of 10 aircraft carriers. We're talking like a small city. I don't know how else do you describe it, or maybe a very large town, except, like an aircraft carrier floats on the water, but this thing was up in the air. So ponder that one, reflect on it a little bit. And incidentally, through the 1980s, there were more sightings of objects described as being as large or larger than a football field. And in fact, during the famous Hudson Valley sightings of 1983 and 1984, particularly when those sightings were most frequent, although they did continue through later in the 80s. But in 1984, for example, as the sightings were really becoming fast and furious, you have one on the night of June 14th of 1984, where over the Indian Point nuclear facility, all right, there's a nuclear reactor there. On that night, there's either a triangular or boomerang-shaped object entering the premises of this facility. And, again, you got nuclear, not weapons, but nuclear power there. This is not something where, you just casually go over and fly over this thing. You had several plant employees seeing it. They described it as football field sized. It had intensely bright lights along the sides, and there were high winds that night. But despite that, this object was said to move very smoothly, so the weather did not affect it. I don't know much more about that sighting, and I'm not sure if much more is known about it. But a month later, on July 24th, 1984, was a return of something really huge, I think actually much larger, over the same facility, the Indian Point nuclear facility. July 24th, 1984, at least a dozen workers at the plant and security guards watched a boomerang pattern of lights approach at night. They said to investigators later that they could plainly see that this pattern of lights were not disconnected lights, but that this was a solid body of enormous size. The estimate that they gave is about 900 feet in length or diameter. So you're talking 3 football fields, or again, roughly the size of an aircraft carrier. All right. So this enormous thing moves toward the one operational reactor at the plant at that time and hovered directly over it. So very provocative act. The guards are standing there, just utterly awestruck. And what's interesting is that the commander said to them, have your weapons ready. They had, I think, shotguns, and they're ready to shoot this thing. Like, what's that going to do? But anyway, there was no order to fire. The plant commander was about to activate National Guard helicopters to engage whatever this thing was. And just before that order was given, this object just moved off. And I don't think it zoomed off. I think it just moved off somewhat casually and it was gone. And the guards were told to forget about it. But they, as I mentioned earlier, they did speak to researchers shortly after that. The amazing things here going on in most of the cases where it involves military or something official. You hear again and again that the people involved in this are told, don't discuss this. This is way too serious, and you'll get in a lot of trouble if you do. I want to mention one. I'm not sure if I've ever discussed this particular case on YouTube before, but it's actually a very well-known case, and it's a very well-documented case. I really like this one, and it involves a very large and a object in a very dramatic situation. And this was the Eastland, Ohio event of March 4th, 1988. This is not far from the border with Pennsylvania. If you get a map out there, if you don't know the area, it's pretty easy to see. By the way, there's a nuclear facility not far from this location as well. But you've got the main witness were a family known as the Bakers, Sheila Baker and her husband. At this point, Sheila Baker's with her kids in the car. They're driving home along the shore of Lake Erie. It's about 6:30 p.m. It's getting toward dusk. Again, March 4th of that year. So they notice this large, bright object apparently hovering over the lake. And it seemed almost like a blimp. So you see these bright lights they saw around the end, at each end. And the whole thing was rocking end to end. She said like a seesaw. And one of the lights was strobing a little bit. So they get home, and Sheila tells her husband, Henry, about this. And so they all go back with the family back to the beach. And they're standing there on the shore of Lake Erie. You have this whole family there. And they're seeing this object. They described it as gray, like a gunmetal gray color. And it was positively huge. Later, Henry said it was much larger than a football field, in his opinion, but it was silent. As far as they could tell, they couldn't hear a thing coming out of it. And they're noticing that the ice on the lake is beginning to rumble and crack. The assumption was that there was heat coming from this object and it was breaking apart the ice. Then they see the object begin to circle slowly over part of the lake. And it came almost overhead of them at a very low altitude, like maybe a quarter of a mile above their head. So they're getting a little nervous at this point, understandably. They drive back to their house and they're just watching it from inside their home. And they're still watching it. They watch it descend. They see these blinking lights, red and blue along the bottom edge. And they then see things come out of this object. 5 or 6 bright yellow lights. They're triangular in shape, and they detach from the object, and they see them hovering around the larger object and then zigzagging and darting this way and that at very high speeds. They were maybe the size of a small puddle jumper type aircraft, like a small one-seat Cessna, but they were, Henry later said that, like, you snap your finger and it's across 50 miles across a stretch of lake, like unbelievable speeds. Anyway, a number of those objects were very close to the Perry nuclear plant, which was very close by. Then you get neighbors starting to see it as well. And so eventually, two members of the Coast Guard, responding to a bunch of phone calls, come to the beach. And so there's two of them. One was named John Powers and one was named John Knob, I think is the pronunciation of that name. And they actually connect up with the Bakers who are out there. So everyone's out there watching this, and they're watching the triangular objects approaching them, which prompted them to turn off the headlights of their vehicle. They're like, we're getting too much attention here. So you've got the Coast Guard watching this, and they're watching all these triangles fly over the lake. They see the large object as well, and they're on a two-way radio with their base back in Detroit. And what the Bakers overheard was, be advised, the object appears to be landing on the lake. There are other objects moving around it. Be advised, these smaller objects are going at high rates of speed. There are no engine noises, and they are very, very low. Be advised, these are not planets. So they were very particular about this. All through the area, there were other eyewitnesses, not to the huge object on the lake, but to these little triangles that were zooming all over the place. One was a lady not far from the nuclear plant named Cindy Hale. She's walking her dog. By the way, just as an aside, if you want to see UFOs, get a dog, get a jacuzzi or a hot tub that's outside, or if you really want to damage your health, take up smoking. Those are the three groups that I've always noticed. Like if you see who sees UFOs, people who smoke, people who have dogs, or people who have hot tubs. Hot tubs are fewer sightings, but not many people have hot tubs. But the point is that these are groups of people who are always outside, and you got to be outside to see a UFO. But anyway, so you've got this woman with her dog, and she sees this triangular light hovering above her. Her dog starts to whimper and whine, and there's all these flashing lights. So anyway, there's that. There's another local resident, a guy named Tim Keck, who had this cheap little Instamatic camera. He wanted I think in a Burger King promotion, and he took a picture of one of these bright triangular objects, and the picture actually came out relatively well. Part of the triangle is off the frame, but I was able to reproduce it in Volume 2 of UFOs and National Security State. It was in the possession of Bruce Maccabee, who allowed me to use it. Anyway, meanwhile, back at the lake, you've got this large ship. This is just an incredible story. Is nearly directly on the ice. Henry Baker, he's listening to the Coast Guard guys talk to their base, and they're like, you should be advised, this object is now shining lights all over the lake and is turning different colors. They're hearing these large cracking noises on the lake. They're so loud that the two Coast Guard guys are yelling to hear each other. And suddenly they see the triangles are all back, and they are returning one after the next into this large object. The ice is booming louder and louder. Presumably it's just cracking. And then all the lights of the object go off, and the ice stops making noise, and everything becomes dead silent. Like, they should make a movie out of this scene, in my opinion. Like, this should be a scene in a UFO movie. It's never been done. After another half hour, no one was able to see the object. It was too dark anyway, and there was no light coming from that area. So the assumption was that the object had gone below the surface. And in fact, that would be my guess, because they come back to the morning of March 5th, and there's these huge, these huge broken pieces of ice that are seen where the object had been. The Coast Guard actually a representative of the Coast Guard told the Bakers that they were instructed by the Army and NASA, who the heck knows why NASA got involved in this, except that Sheila Baker had phoned them. Anyway, they were advised not to investigate the matter any further, not to take their ice cutter out to the lake, not to examine the ice, which they were going to do. The matter was out of their league, they said, out of their hands. And they said all the information on this was being forwarded to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and their base probably in Detroit. The Coast Guard, the last good thing that the Coast Guard did is they created an incident report on this, dated March 5th, and it described the event very, very well. And again, this is a report that you can find easily on the web. Gave a lot of the detail that I was just recounting here. So there you go. And here's the deceptive nature, by the way, of how the Air Force and how the government will often dismiss these types of sightings. The very next night, March 5th, Sheila Baker, of course, she's watching the sky. Why wouldn't she? She had just seen this amazing thing the night before. So she's watching the sky and she sees what she thinks is a UFO, or maybe even the same UFO hovering over the lake, but it's much higher than the night before. Now, she didn't really know what she was seeing. So the Coast Guard, again, sent some guys out. They get there too late. They don't see anything. They are then told that these two bright lights were the planets Venus and Jupiter, which were in a near alignment. So the Coast Guard promptly writes a follow-up report to the original report, laying all of this to rest, saying, the whole thing was atmospheric phenomenon. I mean, even though clearly the events of the night of March 4th had nothing to do with any kind of atmospheric phenomenon. It was just very deceptive, very dishonest reporting. But of course, it's not hard to see why they would do this. You have this enormous object that appeared to melt the ice of Lake Erie and appeared to go into Lake Erie, that had all of these triangular objects zooming out, investigating a nearby nuclear power plant, seen by lots of local witnesses. The large object is seen by 2 Coast Guard personnel and a family that is there with them. Wow, just wow. That's an incredible UFO sighting. And I just love the fact that we have at least some paper trail, some document trail. And by the way, I do know that this particular case did get a couple of good write-ups in various like feature magazines and this type of thing. Sheila Baker, I know, was interviewed at least in one long article on this. Fascinating stuff. I'm going to mention one more case from the 20th century. There's a lot from the 21st century. I'm collecting these, and at some point I'll come back and do a live stream on that, I'm sure. But I'm going to end it with this one. And this is not one that some of you are probably expecting. I'm sure a lot of people want me to talk about the Phoenix Lights. And maybe we'll do that some other time. But I want to talk about another sighting from 1996, a few months before the Phoenix Lights of 1997. And this took place in Canada, in the Yukon province, really remote, not far from the border of Alaska. And it was in the dead of winter, December 11th, 1996. All right. At a place called, the main action was near a lake called Fox Lake. It was a frozen lake, about 10 miles long, not far from Alaska. And we're talking hundreds of miles away from anything, like any town or city or any military base for that matter. So very, very remote area. So what you've got is a situation where at least 20 witnesses see this enormous aerial object. It was lit up like a Christmas tree. It was drifting past the lake between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the evening. So very dark. So two of the witnesses, the first 2 witnesses that we learn about were cousins. They're driving in separate vehicles on a trip. Both of them see it. Both of them see it over the lake. Both of them slammed on their brakes and they get out of their cars. So they're standing out there. They're watching this huge object as it's slowly drifting towards the position of one of them, and it's soon almost directly over him. It then moves slowly across the highway and over a hill, going east, and they don't see it anymore after that. So both of these men actually drew pictures of the object. Certainly, it's very impressive. You might think a slow, huge object like this could be a blimp. I mean, that would be the first thing that would come to mind. I would say this is very unlikely. The Goodyear blimp, for example, is very large, nearly 200 feet long, nearly as large as a big airliner. But here's the thing, like, who's unable to recognize a Goodyear blimp, right? But the thing is, this object was much brighter than any Goodyear blimp has ever been, way more lights, and it was much larger, and it was much rounder, and way, much taller than a Goodyear blimp. But anyway, so you got these two cousins, they're watching this. At the same time they're watching this thing, there's a married couple with their baby. They're driving toward them. They're a little bit farther south along the highway. They also see this object, a little more distant than the two cousins, but still pretty clearly. By the time they catch up with the cousins and they pull over, the object had moved off. But this couple continue driving, and then they arrive at a lodge a little farther ahead, and they're all excited. They tell the owner about what they'd seen, and he's like, "Oh yeah, we had a bunch of people came in here a little earlier who had gotten very close to this thing, and they talked about it." There were other witnesses of this as well. There's a nearby village, little town called Pelly Crossing, and other people there described identical object. In one case, the object responded to a man's flashlight. And this is one of these things that it's just, frightening. So he gets a flashlight out at the object, like, "Hey, I'm making contact with extraterrestrials." And the object accelerates toward him. And he's like, "Forget that idea." He turns off the flashlight. The object stopped. At that point, it had given off several beams of light, including one that's swooping along the ground. So he runs, maybe to get away, maybe to get a better view. Who knows? When he turned around to look for the object again, it was gone. But all in all, there were 22 known witnesses to this object. And in fact, I met the researcher who investigated this, a man named Martin Jaeil, who's a Canadian engineer, as well as a UFO researcher, a very meticulous man, in my opinion, very like sober, rational, level-headed guy. So he interviewed the witnesses to this. In fact, you can find this on the web. That case includes a lot of drawings, lots of detailed interviews that he got. They're all online. The thing about it, I mean, very remote location. The fact that it is as remote as it is, I think, unfortunately, has been part of the reason that it's relatively unknown, but a heck of a case. In fact, with any good UFO case, you can be sure that there's always going to be an attempt by someone to debunk it. There are skeptics out there, but then there are debunkers. Like, it's one thing to be skeptical of UFOs. I get that. I'm skeptical about a lot of UFO reports myself. But when you get these full-time debunkers, I really often wonder, like, what is their motivation here? And this case also fell into the radar crosshairs of debunkers. And they said, well, yeah, this happened at the same time that a Russian satellite was coming into Earth orbit. So clearly that's what it was. I'm like, what? Like, that doesn't correspond with any single one of the witness testimony. It's like, you can explain these things away. It's really easy. All you have to do is ignore witness testimony. Just pretend that these people said something totally different than what they actually said. Then sure, it's easy to debunk anything. So that's the Fox Lake sighting in Yukon in December 1996. I mean, when I was, doing a little bit of research of this for this program tonight, there were so many of these enormous UFO sightings, and it's, they were a minority of total UFO cases, obviously. Nonetheless, there are enough of them that it's really quite noticeable that these objects are clearly out there in some number. So the question is, what are these things that are so large, the size of small cities, and not just with incredible size, that beyond anything that we are known to have been able to make, but with speed and performance capabilities that are exceptional. You know, the number of the cases I described where objects just are moving in many, many thousands of miles per hour, sometimes from a flat hovering, motionless starting point, and they just instantly accelerate. And we, of course, come across these types of cases many, many times. It's also obvious that some of them involve military engagements, and not surprisingly, great levels of concern by military authorities. Of course they would. So what are these things for? I mean, some of them are the size of a decent sized village. Some of them even larger, like a small town or a small city. All right. Well, I don't know what they're for, but they're not just ordinary craft that are designed to transport aliens or beings from one place to another. Are they living facilities? Are they places where these beings live? I suspect the answer to that is probably yes. Are they more than that? I mentioned at the beginning of this, when I was chatting with Tracy, that we were going into a lot of the research of David Jacobs, and you know, his opinion about these very large craft is that maybe they're factories. And I think it's an interesting thought. Factories doing what? Well, in his opinion, I don't know that this is the case, but factories to create the whole hybrid scenario that he talks about. But I don't know. But they could be facilities of some sort. They could be their version of industrial facilities, or large. I assume that there's some kind of large, either living facilities or long-term quarters, or a large base of operations, like a portable military base. Like that's the other assumption that I have, particularly where you see, like in the East Lake, Ohio case, where these objects are coming out, or in some of the other military cases, the Navy ones I described, where you've got smaller craft going into a mothership and so forth.